Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webcast, Putting Open Source Dynamic Languages Through the Licensing Test, a guide to most popular licenses and their implications. Brought to you by Haynes and Boone LLP and ActiveState. I'm Jesse Kasman, today's announcer. I have just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar will have an interactive Q&A session between you and our presenters. Just type a question into the question window at any point during the presentations and click the submit button. Near the end of the webinar, we'll try and answer as many questions as time will allow. This program also contains 3 short polls. The polling questions will appear in the slide presentation window. Please just complete the polls when they appear and click on the submit answer button right there in the polling slide when you're finished. Thanks in advance for your answers. Okay, now on to the presentations. Discussing today's topic will be Van Lindberg, a software engineer and practicing attorney. What he does most, though, is translate from lawyer to engineer and back. He likes working with both computer code and legal code to get things done. Before becoming a lawyer, Van was an R&D engineer at NTT Vario, building automation tools and distributed systems mostly in Python. He's been involved in open source since 1994 when a friend introduced him to Linux. Currently, Van works for Haynes and Boone LLP, a law firm headquartered in Dallas. Van's work at Haynes and Boone touches on both traditional intellectual property and the emerging field of open source law, where he advises businesses and open source groups on intellectual property issues. Van is also the creator of Intellectual Property and Open Source, an acclaimed book on open source licenses published by O'Reilly. 10 attendees today will be randomly selected to get an electronic version of Van Lindberg's book. Also speaking today, we have Bart Copeland, President and CEO of ActiveState. Bart brings 20 years of leadership, management, finance, and business experience to his position as CEO and President of ActiveState. Before he joined ActiveState, Bart led several high-tech organizations in the capacity of President and CEO, including Credo Interactive, iMessaging Systems, Recombo, and Photo Channel Networks. Bart has been instrumental in structuring these organizations in terms of company vision, strategic planning, corporate and legal affairs, marketing strategy, financing, business development and alliances, sales and distribution channels, and administrative operations. So welcome to Van and Bart. And with that, Van, please take it away.
All right. Well, I'm very glad to be here today. You know, it's sort of fun because a lawyer who specializes in open source software will almost be brought in via the call. Now, there are variations of this call for almost every branch of law and for many places in business, but for an open source lawyer, it goes something like this. The caller: hello, I'm calling to ask about some open source software. Lawyer: great, what can I do for you? The caller: well, we have a product shipping out next week, and we just found out one of our engineers used open source in our product. We don't want to release the source code, but we don't know what to do. Can you help us? So what I'm going to talk about today is what an open source lawyer actually does after he receives the phone call. So one of the first things that they teach you in law school is that you need to frame the issues. For our discussion today, that means that we need to look for a second at the legal landscape around open source dynamic languages. There are 4 basic ways in which software can be protected: patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. Patents are time-limited statutory monopolies designed to protect inventions and technological developments. In return for full disclosure of your idea, you're granted the ability to prevent anyone else from making, using, selling, offering for sale, or importing the invention. Patents last for a maximum of about 20 years, after which the invention becomes part of the public domain. During its life, patents are unusual because they protect all implementations of a particular idea. You have the right to prevent other people from practicing, that means either making or using, your invention, even if they independently invent or re-implement what you're talking about. In other words, even if they didn't copy your idea. Because patents offer strong protection, they're designed to be hard to get. Now, this is in theory. A patent must disclose an invention that is, quote, useful, quote, novel, and, quote, non-obvious. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that all granted patents are always useful, novel, and non-obvious. It just means that they've been able to demonstrate certain things that have enabled them to get past the bar. Further, the patent must be completely describe the best way to implement the invention using technical language. From an open source dynamic languages perspective, patents are somewhat controversial. There are thousands of patents on software implemented techniques, including techniques like the methods of garbage collection or JIT compilation that could be used in dynamic language runtimes. There's a currently pending case at the Supreme Court called In re Bilski that may dramatically change the scope and enforceability of software patents. We don't know right now, but we will know within a couple weeks. Next are copyrights. The copyrights are limitations on the expression of the idea. You remember in patents, I talked about how they protect all expressions of an idea. A copyright is limited to a particular way of saying something. They're designed to protect paintings, sculptures, writings, boat hulls, dramatic works, architectural drawings, and anything else that shows individual creative expression. According to the copyright statute, copyright protection automatically attaches to anything you create as soon as it is, quote, fixed in a tangible medium of expression, which basically means as soon as it's written down or recorded somewhere. Copyrights can last from 90 to about 150 years, depending on the circumstances. Now, generally, copyright protection is not as strong as patent protection. Copyright protection does not prohibit other expressions of the same idea. As an extreme case, identical works could occur created completely independently, do not infringe the other person's copyright. Further, copyright law has some built-in exceptions that allow other people to use copyright materials without the consent of the copyright owner. Copyright law is applicable to software as a non-dramatic literary work. Although copyright law does not cover the purely functional parts of software code, most code has enough originality to receive at least weak copyright protection. Now, trademarks protect the association of a provider of goods or services with a picture, word, slogan, or tune, which is known generically as a mark. Trademarks were originally developed as an extension to the concepts of unfair competition and consumer protection. They're used to protect consumers by preventing the counterfeiting of goods and helping maintain the reputations of the companies and artisans that produce various goods and services. In recent years, this has expanded to cover also the concepts of branding and customer loyalty. Now, trademarks are unusual in several respects. The first, trademarks can last as long as they are used. For example, it's highly unlikely that for a very long time anyone will ever be able to open a steakhouse called McDonald's because the hamburger chain is just so well known. Second, trademark protections must not overlap. Two companies cannot use the same mark in the same market for the same goods. This is to ensure that there's always a clear association between a particular mark and the associated trademark holder. And the third is that trademarks must be defended. Copyrights and patents don't have to be asserted to have value, but trademarks will die if they are not defended when they are infringed. One example of a trademark in the open source dynamic language space is ActivePerl or ActivePython. ActiveState holds registrations on these terms, and so ActiveState can control their use by third parties. Now, trade secrets are the oldest form of intellectual property, and a trade secret is just information that derives value in part from being kept a secret. For example, Apple keeps information about its future products plans a secret, and this helps increase the excitement around each product release and Apple show. Trade secrets last as long as their secret status is actively protected. Now, what's of most use here, however, is a focus on the open source licensing attached to most dynamic languages. So what's open source? Most people can't give a definition of open source, even those who work with open source projects on a day-to-day basis. There are lots of definitions out there, but I think that the best one is that open source is a framework that allows people to share and trade intellectual property, and in this case, code. This is different from traditional software licensing where you typically trade intellectual property for money. They say they'll give you their code and you give them your money. with open source, you typically trade your code for their code. So how is this different from traditional software licensing other than the money aspect? Because you can buy open source software. Well, under traditional software licensing, companies own the copyrights to all the software they distribute. Or in some cases, there are portions of code licensed from somebody else, but to the consumer, it all looks the same. It looks like the company owns the code. The source code is usually considered secret, and the use of the compiled binaries is controlled via the license. An example here is something like Adobe Photoshop or Microsoft Windows, where you are not able to look inside it. Instead, these companies grant you a license to use their code under certain circumstances in return for your money. Now, open source projects are owned by their communities, or more precisely by their contributors. In a typical open source project, each contributor maintains copyright to the code he contributes to the project. And by agreeing to share the coder in turn receives the benefit of all the other code shared by the other people in the project. The open source licenses provide the structure by which these contributors agree to share and cooperate in the development of the code. And the use of the binaries, that's typically unrestricted. So, to sum up here, open source software, like other software, is primarily controlled via copyright. Now, the source code, just like other works, is copyrighted as soon as it is created and fixed in a tangible medium. That means as soon as you write it down and save it to your hard disk. Copyright holders allow others to use the software by granting a license, which is a specialized contract allowing someone to exercise some of the exclusive rights under copyright in return for some sort of payment or other what's called consideration. In typical software contracts, this money. In open source licenses, this consideration takes the form of some restrictions on the modification or the distribution of the code. So one quick aside, there's a difference between software that's available for free, software that is free software according to the Free Software Foundation, and software that is open source. First, open source and free software is not really about money. Some software is just available for free. One example is ActiveState's Komodo editor. It still has a proprietary license associated with that product as a whole. Open source and free software are defined terms that refer to rights, or, under the free software definition, freedoms that are granted with the code. Although open source and free software as defined are not exactly the same, the term open source as we're using it here is broad enough to cover both. If something is free software, then it is automatically open source. So the leading case dealing with open source software in the United States is called Jacobson v. Katzer. Now, the Jacobson court was the one that established that an open source license may set conditions limiting the use of copyrighted material. What that means is that if you don't obey the license, you are going to be in violation of copyright. Now, what was this about? Surprisingly, this was about model railroads. Robert Jacobson managed an open source software project called the Java Model Railroad Interface, or JMRI. The JMRI software was distributed under an open source license known as the Artistic License. That license included a couple common provisions. It was fairly open. Well, all it said is that, number one, you must acknowledge where you got the software from. Number two, you must keep the copyright notices intact. And number three, you need to include the original license file. And also you had to say, here are the things that has been changed. Well, Katzer decided to take this code, and he basically did none of those things. He filed off the copyrights, he filed off the license, and put this forth as his own work. When Jacobson found out about this, he sued Katzer and sought an injunction to stop him from distributing this code. It went through a number of different phases, but ultimately the Federal Circuit held that the restrictions set forth in the artistic license, even as minimal as they were enforceable conditions of copyright license. So this case just settled, and the terms of the settlement are public. As part of the settlement, Capture was prohibited from doing anything with or distributing JMRI materials, which is basically anything associated with the JMRI project, and was prohibited from registering any domain names with the JMRI project. Plus, there was a payment of $100,000 plus costs and attorney's fees. For a little bit of perspective, this payment of $100,000 was approximately $5,000 of damages per copy, or approximately 100 times the total revenues that Capture took in from his infringing sales. The bottom line here is that you really need to pay attention to your software licenses, even or especially if they are open source licenses. Perhaps some of you can imagine what might happen if you started distributing Microsoft Windows or Adobe Photoshop without permission. Probably there would be a quick and very painful lawsuit, and open source licenses are no different. You need to pay attention when you distribute open source software.
Okay, Van, thanks very much. We're going to jump in here real quick with a quick poll for everyone. You should be seeing on your screen here very shortly, how important is it to indemnify open source software in your enterprise? And you can select very important, important, not very important, unimportant, or you don't have an opinion. We're going to do this pretty quickly, so I'll give you about 30 seconds. This kind of feedback is really great for us to gauge our audience, and so if you get a chance, just give us a quick answer. I'll give you another 20 seconds. We have a couple comments that maybe the who's identifying whom. That's certainly a good point. In this case, we're going to take your quick opinion and move forward just so we can get back to Van's presentation, but definitely a good point. All right, everyone, we're going to close up and get back to Van's presentation. It looked like a good 42% are saying very important, 24% important. So in a legal webinar, it's probably pretty obvious, but appreciate it. Thank you very much. And Van, let's see, close that, and we should be back to your presentation.
Sounds great. So I said that you need to pay attention to your software licenses. So what are the provisions that you need to pay attention to? Well, in a perfect lawyerly answer, that depends. There's actually a spectrum of different possible open source licenses, ranging from licenses that allow you to do almost anything that you want with the code to more restrictive licenses that require your code to be licensed and redistributed with if you do certain things and you create what's called a derivative work. We'll talk about this more in just a few minutes. So there are actually hundreds of different open source licenses, but they usually fit into this spectrum that I was saying in one of 4 places. Next slide, please. So so you see the spectrum here. The so-called academic licenses allow you to do almost anything with the code as long as you don't claim that it's yours. These licenses, like the BSD or Berkeley Software Distribution license or the MIT license, got their name from the colleges and universities that developed the code for education or research and then released it under these liberal licenses because they got what they wanted out of it. Next up are permissive licenses. These allow almost as much freedom as the academic licenses, but they have a few additional restrictions. Sometimes these restrictions relate to patent licensing, saying that you license any patents that apply to this particular code that you just license any patents that you have that apply to the particular code that you just contributed. Sometimes they relate to trademarks, saying that there is a trademark associated with this product and you agree not to use it. And sometimes there needs to be an acknowledgement that you're using the code. For example, the artistic license that we were talking about earlier was a permissive license because it said you just have to tell other people This is artistic license code. You have to tell people where it came from and what changes you made to it. Next up are the reciprocal licenses. Now, when I talk about reciprocal licensing, there's a simple rule. If something comes into your hands under a reciprocal license, then it needs to leave your hands under the reciprocal license. So, for example, if you're given a piece of software under the GPL, which is probably the most famous and widely used reciprocal license, then when you give it to somebody else, you also need to give it to the next person under the GPL, including all the rights and source code that you received. Now, the difference between limited reciprocal licenses and strong reciprocal licenses is this. You can, under certain circumstances, use limited reciprocal code and with proprietary code and not have to apply the reciprocal license to the stuff that you wrote. For a strong reciprocal license, both the original code and any code that you add to it, for various technical legal definitions of add to it, must be licensed under the reciprocal license. Now this gets pretty complicated, and in fact, this is usually the most complicated portion of an open source lawyer's job. Where does your code start and their code end? Well, it really has to do with two terms of art under copyright, called collective works and derivative works. So the copyright statute says that a collective work or a compilation is created when a person brings together pre-existing materials or data in such a way that the resulting work as a whole constitutes an original work of authorship. Now, one thing that a lot of people have done, they've created these compilation works. If you've ever created a mixtape, now I know I'm dating myself, or a mix CD, or a playlist these days, you create that to evoke a particular mood, to communicate something to someone else. Your selection of the particular songs for that playlist is a creative act, and so you created a collective work. Now, you don't have copyright to any of the underlying songs, but your particular arrangement and selection of songs is something that is copyrighted by you. So in the statute, it says a collective work is a work such as a periodical issue, anthology, or encyclopedia in which a number of contributions constituting separate and independent works in themselves are assembled into a collective whole. From our perspective, think of a Linux distribution or a dynamic language runtime with a bunch of bundled libraries. All those different libraries were written by different people. They have independent copyrights and independent licenses. Now, in contrast, there are derivative works. A derivative work is a work that's based upon one or more pre-existing works in which the work may be called recast, transformed, or adapted. That generally is interpreted to mean that it is changed in some way in a transformative manner. A work that consists of editorial revisions or annotations or elaborations or other modifications which are still, that as a whole represent something new, something creative, is a derivative work. Now, one easy place to see this derivative work is in a patch. For example, if you create a patch that adds functionality to an already existing library or runtime, then you've contributed something creative, and that has its own copyright. However, your creative contribution was made to build on top of and extend another person's creative work, and that makes your work derivative of the original code. So, you're asking yourselves, why do I care? And the answer is this: if something is a collective work, then the copyrights are independent. The licenses are independent. If something is a derivative work, then the copyrights are tied, so the licenses are tied. Or to put this a little more bluntly, assume that you've got a project where you use reciprocally licensed code, such as code under the GNU GPL. If you have created a collective work, then your code gets your license. If you've created a derivative work, then your code also needs to be licensed under the GPL. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be surprising to many people. it's also difficult under many circumstances to draw the line between what is a collective work and what is a derivative work. Reciprocal open source licenses rely on the copying and derivative works provisions of copyright law to determine their scope. For example, the GNU GPL, which I've referred to a couple times, applies to, quote, either the program or any derivative work under copyright law. That's for version 2. Version 3 has some similar language. The definition of derivative work, however, can be really unclear when it comes to software, which leads to some uncertainty in the scope of the license. I would also warn you away as well from random opinions on the internet. Almost any time someone says that this software is clearly a derivative work of that software, then you can know that that person is almost certainly incorrect. The answer is very rarely clear, even to those of us who have been doing this for a while. So I need to return again to the bottom line, that you need to pay attention to your software licenses. Now, to a certain extent, this is one of the services that are provided by aggregators like ActiveState. Part of what they do is create distributions of open source or open source-based products and harmonize and handle some of the legal issues so that there's a single point of contact. So for a little more discussion of what ActiveState does, I'll turn the time over to Bart.
All right, Ben, actually this is Jesse. We're going to jump in one more time with a quick poll as we're transitioning over to Bart's presentation. If you're tuned in, you probably see now on your screen, does your company pay attention to its software licenses? Ben brought this up twice. You need to pay attention. We're really curious where you're at right now. We'll give you 30 seconds to work through this. All right, and maybe just 10 more seconds. Looks like pretty radically, yes, we pay attention, leading at 59%. All right, everyone, thanks very much for participating. And now, Bart, if we could hand it over to you.
Great, Jesse. Thank you. And thanks, Van, for a great overview on the various licensing options that exist within open source. What I wanted to do now was to apply some of the ideas and aspects that Van shared with you and apply it to specifically dynamic languages. And one thing I often get asked is, well, how important are dynamic languages in the open source spectrum of things? And then the next slide I'd like to show you here is that actually dynamic languages are important. And you can see Dr. Dobbs recently did a survey, and dynamic languages or programming languages, open source programming languages are the most popular adopted open source project out there. And 57% of enterprises today globally are using dynamic languages. So clearly they're relevant. They're ahead of operating systems, IDEs, databases, servers, et cetera, et cetera. So they're relevant. So that's a good segue into the next slide, where we look at some of the challenges of dealing with open source dynamic languages. And some of these challenges you guys may already be familiar with, but one of the things we see is that when you're dealing with a dynamic language, whether it's Perl, whether it's Tcl, or whether it's Python, they're time-consuming to compile, test, and maintain. Because as you know, with an open source project, it's constantly evolving and new versions and updates of the distribution are occurring. They need to be recompiled on the platform that you care about, and then you need to test it to make sure it works with your system. Another challenge is standardization and compatibility across all systems. So you can get a distribution of Perl and Tcl or Python from a number of different places. You can get it on your operating system. Usually it's included there. You can get it from the open source community. You can get it from ActiveState. And as well, the different version may exist depending on the platform you're working on, whether you're working on HPUX, AIS, Solaris, or Windows, or Mac, or Linux. The version of it may be different. So the larger you get as an organization, this can become quite difficult to standardize on a single distribution. Another challenge that we often see is database connectivity. So what database are you using? Are you using a Postgres? Are you using MySQL? Are you using an Oracle or a SQL? How do you connect with the database? And it'll vary the connectivities depending on the distribution you have. Another key challenge that we see, and this one's a biggie, is the modules. As you know, the open source dynamic language, there's a core version of it, and then there's a whole bunch of modules around it that support it. Those modules come from a variety of different authors in the open source community, and there's thousands to choose from within, whether it's Perl or Tickle or Python. So how do you know which ones to choose? And from the question, when I say how do you know, from the perspective of which ones are work and are reliable. And then there's the other thing of licensing with these modules, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And the final thing, the final challenge that we often see is, especially with as a company gets larger, is how much reliance do they want to put on the open source community from the perspective of you're working with Perl on a mission critical application, and you run into a significant problem. Do you want to go out in the open source community and communicate your problems on this mission critical application? So there's a privacy issue. Often you can spend a lot of time, wasted time and resources dealing with the standardization, the compiling, the testing, the compatibility issue. And then finally, the other thing you have to be careful of is the potential system downtime. If you're using an open source dynamic language and let's say you've been using Perl 5.10 and you're upgraded to 5.12 and you've got Perl on a mission-critical application and your system goes down, what do you do? So these are some of the challenges. Now, before I go on and tell you guys how ActiveState helps mitigate these challenges, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse because he has a poll question for you guys.
All right, we're going to jump right into the poll. Bart was talking about challenges. We're pretty curious about what kind of challenges you're seeing. Unfortunately, we're a little limited in this, the software here. I'm sure there's a long list of different possible issues, but what are your biggest challenges around open source licensing? Instead of just listing the ones that Bart put in his slide, we wanted to see if there were some other areas. So if we can get your vote real quick, and we'll go from there. I'll give you another 20 seconds. You got to be quick. You got to be quick. It's great. Seems like so far the too many licenses seems to be a big issue. That's at about 38% of the answers.
And it's definitely okay if you say lawyers are too costly.
Honesty is good. All right, great. We appreciate you voting. We're going to close this up, and we'll get back to Bart's slides here. All right. That should be moving you forward.
So with those challenges in mind, why ActiveState's dynamic languages? And we tend to divide this in two areas. One is from the IT development perspective, and the other area is from the business legal perspective. So I'll first do the IT development, and obviously then I'll touch on the business legal, which mirrors very nicely with Van's talk. From the IT development perspective, what we help our customers do is faster time to market. So a number of those challenges that we talked about on the previous slide is we help our customers, and as a result, they can get to market quicker with what they're doing around dynamic languages, which leads into increased staff productivity. And then finally, another key reason why customers deal with us is uptime on critical applications. We often say we're the throat that our customers can choke when they run into troubles. And so these are some of the key reasons why customers come to us from an IT development perspective. The other key aspect, though, is business and legal. And many customers have a requirement or a compliance requirement. If you use open source, you must have third-party support. Now, this varies depending on organization. Some organizations say, look, if the open source is not a mission-critical or business-critical, but it's just being used on a side project, you don't need commercial support. To the other where the other extreme is, if you're on mission critical or business critical, you must have third-party commercial support. So we help in that regard. The next key business legal issue is about legal risk mitigation. So I have a detailed slide on this, but the poll question revealed that there are too many licenses. Well, we effectively help tremendously manage all of these nuances and permutations with the various license agreements that exist around open source programming languages, or dynamic languages. And then the final area where we help significantly at ActiveState is, and again, Van talked about this, the collective work versus the derivative work, and especially you need to be careful when you're using open source and how you are including it with your products and then you're distributing those products. We help with the distribution rights when it comes to Perl, Tickle, and Python. We take care of that. We give you peace of mind so you don't have to worry about that. And that's a good segue into the next slide, where I want to talk about specifically how we mitigate some of the legal risks that you tend to see associated with dynamic languages. So what we do is we audit and evaluate the scope of the open source dynamic language in use. Specifically what we do is we look at the and I'll use again Perl as an example, but it applies to Tickle and Python. We look at the core distribution that's in the open source community, and we make sure that our distribution is complying with that core. But where it gets really interesting is that our distribution also includes many, many, many modules. And we make sure that we are including in our distributions the modules that are license friendly and that won't cause a problem with your distribution. And that's a nice segue into, you get a turnkey licensing, include third-party modules from ActiveState. So all these licenses that you have to worry about, because you do have to worry about it. You download a distribution of Perl, and you have to look at each license that's associated with each module. And it can be quite laborious, and there's gotchas in there. So we take care of that because our modules are, to the extent there's any module that is dicey, we don't include it. So that, again, as I said earlier, gives a lot of peace of mind. And then the final thing on this slide that I want to touch on is secure, guaranteed redistribution rights. Because, and I'm just repeating myself here, but because of the complexities that you see, whether it's a collective work or a derivative work, we take care of those nuances for you. And furthermore, we indemnify you. So to the extent there's a problem, we indemnify you and protect you because we are giving you the assurances that we've taken care of that. So if there is a litigious action, it's on our dime, not your dime. So with that in mind, now I want to move on to, we talked about how we mitigate legal risks. Let's look at how we mitigate operational risks. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is the challenge is that there's so many different versions of the dynamic language out there. So you use an enterprise-grade dynamic language distribution from ActiveState. And the beauty of this is that you have one distribution, and you know it's the same regardless of which platform you're using, and you know it's going to work with all your mission-critical or business-critical applications. So, for example, we have a significant customer. They have 2,000 servers. They are using both Python and Perl. These servers are used, but they're using HPUX and AIX, and I believe Windows and Linux. So they get from us a standard version. They're using Python 2.6 and Perl 5.10. Active Perl 5.10, I should say, and Active Python 2.6. They've standardized it across that, and they deploy it across all of their servers. And they know that those two distributions work with their mission-critical applications. The second operational risk that we mitigate is we work with our customers and help them with the best practices advice and how-to guidance working with the dynamic language they care about. That's just standard with what we offer. But often what we also see is customers, they're ready to deploy, or they're going to deploy, and they have specific questions they need help with. So we provide professional services around their unique deployments. So with that in mind, I want to move on to the next slide, because I would like to just briefly talk about an example of a specific customer we've worked in, both from a enterprise support perspective and also an OEM perspective or a redistribution perspective. So Computer Associates, or CEA, has worked with us for a number of years, and we've saved them significant development costs and time, and we provide greater time, faster time to market because they have standardized over our versions of the distributions. Furthermore, we speed up their QA cycles because as a result, they don't have to QA the distribution. We've taken care of that. They only need to QA the higher value add components that they work on. As well, we mitigate all of their legal risks, all of these various things we've talked about today, as well as we satisfy their demands for indemnification. So it's a turnkey solution that we provide CA. So with that background, a question that I often get asked is cost savings. So, okay, Bart, what does it cost vis-a-vis doing open source versus doing enterprise dynamic language solution from ActiveState? So I'd like to run you through this example. Now, I need to stress this is an example, and our experience has been it varies on a case-by-case basis depending on your needs as a user of open source programming languages. What I'm going to take you through here on the far left-hand side of the table, you see the various stages of working with open source that was considered. The next column is the cost associated with going pure open source. The following table is, or following column, sorry, is the cost dealing with ActiveState, and then finally your savings. So firstly, let's look at the acquisition line. So your acquisition cost to use an open source dynamic language or to use one from ActiveState is zero. There is no cost. In this particular case, in the first year, the development cost would have been about $120,000 for this particular customer if they had gone on their own. However, working with ActiveState, we saved them approximately $30,000 by accelerating their development efforts as well as the support we were able to provide them, which resulted in approximately 25% savings. The next line, training, in this case it wasn't significant. They were pretty proficient in the dynamic language. However, we were able to save them some time in some specific areas to reduce some of their training costs. The big savings is the maintenance and support. I talked to you about maintaining the builds, the testing, the compatibility on the various platforms. In this particular case, it would have cost them one of their engineers significant of their time to do that maintenance and support. With ActiveState, there was a significant savings because we freed up their development team or this particular developer to work on the value add that they truly can provide into the product. Finally, and this is definitely a grayer area to put costs associated with you, but the legal aspect, the distribution rights. So typically, all the effort that you need to do to go into to make sure you're complying with all the licenses, typically we estimated somewhere around $17,000 in this particular case. In our case, we take care of it. There is a fee associated with that. But with that as well, you get the peace of mind that you know if there's any problems, you're protected, you're indemnified, and we've taken care of all of that. And as you've seen in the case between Jacobson and Kapsner, if you're wrong, it can be quite expensive. And in that case, you could see it was still very expensive for the amount of distribution that occurred because there wasn't a lot of distribution. So all told, you can see in this cost savings, there is about an $87,000 cost savings, plus we provide the indemnification and the peace of mind and the time to market that goes in addition to the cost savings. And all those softer points that I mentioned are very difficult to quantify that we don't put it in this chart. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how we mitigate some of the operational and the legal risks with open source programming languages. And with that in mind, I just want to go over to the next slide and briefly touch on how we do this as an aggregated solution at ActiveState. So we are experts in dynamic languages, or we, as ActiveState, the dynamic language experts, and we provide a complete solution for dynamic languages. And we talk about this from the develop, manage, and distribute perspective. So first of all, we have tools that help developers working with dynamic languages. Then we have a suite of solutions about managing your dynamic languages, whether it's training, whether it's consulting, whether it's commercial support around your distributions and compliance. That's all the managed part. We take care of that. And then finally, to the extent you need to distribute a dynamic language with your product, bundle it with your product, so you provide a seamless solution to your customer, we take care of all of that, and we provide you with distribution rights, indemnification. So it's a full solution to develop, manage, and distribute around dynamic languages. And who do we do this for? If we go to the next slide, we have significant penetration into the finance and banking sector, such as Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, Bank of America. We're deep into the aerospace and defense, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, GE Aviation, and then not surprisingly, we have many, many relationships in the software, hardware space or the high-tech space, whether it's CA or VMware, just to mention a few. As well, we have a number of partnerships through the people on through the companies on the right-hand side. Obviously, Sun now is part of Oracle, but we wanted to show the separation of Sun and Oracle because Sun has been around for such a long time, and we've been a partner with Sun for many years. This is a good way to segment to the last slide before we turn over the Q&A. And I just want to put ActiveState in perspective. We've been around since 1997. We service and touch over 2 million developers worldwide. 97% of the Fortune 1000 rely on solutions and products and distributions from ActiveState. As I mentioned, we're all about the development, management, and distribution of solutions for dynamic languages. But one thing I want to close on is that we look at dynamic languages from a first tier and second tier. You've heard me mention Perl, Python, and Tcl many times. Those are our first tier languages, and you can get a complete solution around Perl, Python, and Tcl from ActiveState, i.e. the development, the management, and distribute aspect. However, the other dynamic languages that we care about, and the important ones, are PHP, Ruby, and JavaScript. However, with those, we only support them from a developer tool perspective. We don't have the manage and distribute point of view. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jesse to manage the Q&A, and I want to thank Van for his contributions to this webinar today.
All righty. Thanks very much to both Bart and Van. Now it's time for a little bit of a Q&A session. If you haven't already, please type your questions into the question window and hit the submit button. We'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. We have a couple already. First question seems nice and pragmatic. It's directed at Van. It says, you end your presentation with pay attention to your software licenses. Is there a good way, Van, to start paying attention without paying tons of attorney's fees right away?
That's a great question. I think that the number one thing that people need to do is come to grips with how much open source is being used within their organization. To give just one example, one of my clients, this was before they contacted me, they did an informal survey to see how much open source was there in their organization. Now this is a fairly large organization, and they had expected it would be in maybe 15 or 20% of their projects. They found that it was in way over 90% of their shipping projects. So in terms of getting a handle on things, the very first thing that you can do is educate yourself, educate your engineers, figure out what it is you're actually using, because that's an introspective exercise that can really pay a lot of dividends.
Okay, great. Thanks, Van. One here for Bart. Perl is based on GPL, so why does Active Perl require a special license to redistribute?
Okay. Well, first of all, actually Perl is the Perl core, not the modules, but the Perl core is dual license under either the artistic or GPL license. So you need to choose at the time whether you go artistic or GPL. Now, Active Perl leverages the more liberal artistic license as the basis to redistribute our extended distribution of Active Perl. Now, I'm not skirting the question, but I just want to preface this. Then, so whereas the Perl modules, the modules outside the core, are based on many different licenses, whether it's artistic, GPL, BSD, etc., depending on what the module author has decided. So what I'm getting at, so you're free to distribute the open source Perl provided you comply with all these licenses, both the core Perl and the licenses in various modules. But going back to the question, why do we require a special license to redistribute? Is because we have, in addition to the open source bits that are included, we also include some proprietary bits of ActiveState. And as such, our proprietary bits are governed by this special license, or in case it's the ActiveState license. As well, our customers often require indemnifications regarding distribution. So in order to do that and do it properly, we have to have a special license, as this person asked the question, in order to accommodate the indemnification provision. So hopefully that's answered the question.
Okay, great.
I also might jump in there that one thing that ActiveState does is they have also, in doing this and bringing together these modules, not just the proprietary bits that they add in, but in the selection and the creation of this fatter active Perl distribution, they've created a copyrightable collective work that they also license as a portion of giving that under that contract.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Van, maybe connected with that, here's an interesting question. You hear a lot about cloud computing. How do open source licenses affect SaaS? Is SaaS truly distributed? SaaS, of course, software as a service, things that are built in the cloud.
That is again, I have to say it depends. It depends on the licenses that you're using and the way that you're using the various particular pieces of software. To get right to the point, there is a particular series of licenses, generally known as the Affero GPL. There are officially 3 versions, but most people are using the Affero GNU GPL version 3, which says that if you make the software available over the network, then you are contractually, under the license, also required to provide either the software and any derivative works to end users also over the network. Now that does go, again, only as far as the derivative works go. There are certain ways in which some parts of an application could be covered by this license and others would not. A good example is there's a graph database out there that's licensed under the Affero GPL, and if you put up a service that uses this graph database, then the code that runs your service would be licensed under the AGPL under most circumstances, but the data that you are serving would not, because that has a separate copyright. So again, it depends. To sum up, if you're under the AGPL, a SaaS service could be considered a distribution or similar licenses, but in other cases, it's probably not.
And I can just add to that. It's we see this quite often, and as Van has indicated, you've got to read the license agreement. You have to read it very carefully, because some have been specifically geared towards recognizing cloud-based applications or SaaS-based applications, and others haven't been. And often we get calls from customers, and they're doing a specific thing with active Perl as an example. Again, it can be Perl or Tcl or Python, and even though it's on a server in their facility, but it's serving up to outside users, it is a form of distribution.
Okay, great, thanks. Here's one from the field. I think it's kind of interesting, sort of properly paranoid. I have the same feeling myself. I'll direct it at Van first, but Bart, maybe you have opinion as well. What do you see as the greatest risk licensing-wise? For instance, is something hidden in Java licensing that have many companies at risk without realizing? What is the most common issue you see out there?
I think if I were to identify one hidden issue, there are a lot, but if I were to identify one hidden issue, it is the idea of you are responsible for compliance with the licenses that pass through your hands. Now, to give you an example, let's say that you are part of some supply chain that eventually ends up in a product that gets distributed to someone somewhere else. Someone below you incorporates the Linux kernel, builds it on the Linux kernel, or incorporates a GPL licensed version of Perl. Then whether or not you know it, and whether or not the people below you complied, as soon as you turn around and you give it to the next person in the chain, you are responsible for being compliant with those licenses. Even if you're not really interacting with that code or building on top of it, the fact that it passes through your hands makes you a link in this distribution chain, and you need to make sure you're compliant. A lot of times people don't properly pay attention to what's going on up and down their supply chain.
I can just add to that, Van, is we do see this quite a bit, is that ActiveState is dealing with kind of 1 degree of freedom to a customer, and they may be a smaller customer, a smaller type of company, and they are in turn selling to a larger company, so the next degree of freedom. It's the larger company is saying to the smaller company, do you have any open source in your product? And the moment they say yes, they say, we don't want to touch your product because of what Van just mentioned. So by, and I realize it's a little bit of salesmanship, and I don't mean it to be this way, I'm just trying to answer the caller's question, is that what happens is by then working with ActiveState, we are protecting that company, and that company then, the smaller company, can now work with the bigger company because they're saying, no, we're dealing now with a proprietary distribution, and there is no open source. So we see this type of supply chain often in the conversations we're having with customers.
Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that open source is a fantastic tool for building a lot of things, and you can deliver a lot of value on top of open source. Sometimes that requires tools, legal tools like ActiveState gives you, but I have to say frequently, if you come up to someone who says absolutely no open source, then they probably haven't thought through all the issues because they're probably already using it.
Yes.
All right, great. I think we have time for about one more. Actually, there's one here that's real nitty-gritty. I thought, Van, you might appreciate this. If I develop a web interface with Perl CGI bin script, can I distribute Active Perl and Apache along with my scripts?
Well, for distributing Active Perl, Active Perl can only be distributed from ActiveState's website and from the perl.org servers. So in specific, the answer is no, because unless you get a redistribution license from ActiveState.
That's correct.
To the broader question of if I have a web application that is built with Perl from somewhere, and can I distribute Apache and Perl gotten from somewhere else, then the answer is yes. And if you choose to take Perl, say from perl.org, under the artistic license, as ActiveState has done, then you don't have any further redistribution obligations.
All right, great. All right, well, that's probably all the time we have for today. Just to be clear, if we didn't get to your questions, if they weren't answered here, we've got it recorded. Someone from our side will absolutely get back in touch with you with an answer shortly. Also, a fair amount of you have asked. This webinar is archived, and you will be able to access it from the ActiveState website. It normally takes about 24 hours for that process and to make it available. So Won't be there instantly, but look for it very soon. So thank you very much to both Van and Bart, and especially thank you to our audience for your participation today. Thanks a bunch, guys.
No problem.
Great. Good day.
Glad to do it.
And on
Bye-bye.
behalf of myself and everyone at ActiveState, thank you. Have a great day.